You gotta take a little break sometimes. You gotta have some fun sometimes. But let's stop this right now. Hold on. How's it going, everybody? Let's look into promises. And promises are very neat and are very useful. And I'm gonna explain why in a second. I'm gonna get my fancy pointer again. I'm gonna call it fancy pointer in every video. But promises in JavaScript, ES6 specifically, or JavaScript in general, because they've been around for a long time, but they allow us to run code in the future once some other work is completed. That is honestly the simplest way that I could think of to explain. And the way it's very useful, I'm gonna show you in a second, but I want you to look at this graph right here. So this graph right here depicts how a promise works in JavaScript. You see, a promise is, think of it's a job, it's a piece of task, right? Think of it as a function. And this function is pending and it's doing something, okay? It's doing something, you know, you see this percentage sign right here. So it's kind of, think of it as loading. You know how you have a loading icon, for example? Let's say when you're uploading a new photo or something like that, right? Let's say you're loading and loading. And what happens is once it's loaded or once the task has been finished, then it gets resolved. However, if the task is not finished or an error happens, then it gets rejected. And the reason why it's so useful is because we can now run code, as we like to say, asynchronously, meaning parallel, meaning some other code can be running while something else is happening, and then we can respond to that something else later. Basically, think of it as, you know, you can be doing a lot of tasks at the same time. And so that is, my friends, is asynchronous programming. In this case, promises are asynchronous. I'm going to show you an example here just in a second. So we looked at this graph, okay? Now let's look into some piece of code. The way you set up a promise is very simple. You have a let promise, and then you say, okay, equals new promise. And the new promise has a function that has two parameters, and the two parameters are resolve and reject, okay? Now, obviously, like I said before, we can do, but you can also, for example, you can do a function, right? And you can turn this into a function, but we're using arrow functions right now. So this is a function, gets resolve and reject, and inside here you can basically do anything you want. You can call another function, you can do anything you want inside. They think of it, it's an individual task, right? It's its own task, right? And inside here I have this really simple task that has a timeout. And a set timeout, all it really does, I don't know why this is here, but a set timeout is waits a certain amount of time and then it runs a certain piece of code. So a set timeout in this case is 1,000 milliseconds. So that's its parameter. It's basically 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second. And in here, what happens is after 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second, it runs the resolve function, which is this function right here. You see? And so this resolve function, what happens is says, okay, I have resolved the response. I have the response for you. I've completed my task. Now here is my response. Here is my value after the completion of the task. And really, that's it. And the way we catch that, the way we look for it, and we say, okay, well, let me see what the response is. We say, okay, promise dot then, and then we have a function that gets the response, right? This response. And inside here, we do, here's response after 1 second, and this is the response, okay? So just for you to see, for example, how this works, if I'm going to do console log, this is part 1. You can see, for example, I'm going to put this actually after this promise, and you'll see how the way it runs. If we run this right now, this is part 1. You see, gets loaded first, where even though it's after this piece of code, it gets run first. And then what happens is a second later, we have a response. We have this function that runs. A second later, and it's almost a second later, you can see the time code here, 48 seconds versus 48 seconds and 49 seconds, right? So you can see there's exactly 1 second delay. Right? And so that, my friends, is how promises work. You can also do reject. So let's say something happened and something didn't go right. So what we could do, let me comment this part out. We can do reject, right? Just like that. And we can say reject something went wrong, right? And a lot of times, you know, maybe an API went wrong or response went wrong. And so we reject. So in this case, in order for us to catch that reject, we wouldn't do it inside the .then function, because .then is for a success, right? That's when everything's resolved. But what we do is we do .catch, and .catch also accepts a function response, boom, and inside here we do console log. I'm gonna call this an error for clear purposes, and then we say error, and we console log the error, and we want to see what happens now. So let's try this out. I'm gonna refresh now. This is part 1, get started first. Something went wrong, and the reason why is because we rejected this, right? So that, my friends, is promises. Again, it's like, okay, I completed my task and I promise, now you run the other function. And that, my friends, is how promises work, and we're going to be using them a lot specifically, and not necessarily in a promise fashion 4, but a lot of features on ES6 use promises. For example, when we're calling APIs, or when we are trying to get data from APIs, right? Kind of like how we have a loading icon. Those are promises, and that's the only way for us to figure out when something is completed or when something is finished.